It's Christmas time, which means, in Old Norse literature at least, that it's prime time for some haunting. So today, I'm going to dive into one of the most famous Christmas haunting episodes in the Icelandinga saga with you, and that is the Christmas haunting of Glámr in Grettis saga Ásmundarsonar. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's get medieval. I'm your host Jules, and as I said, today my task is to introduce you to one of the most famous episodes of Christmas haunting in the entire corpus of Old Norse literature, I would say. The first question might be, why is Christmas such a suitable time for haunting in Old Norse literature when so many of us consider spooky time to be October and Halloween? Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know if there is a very specific, clear answer to it. But just imagine the long nights that would happen up north during this time. The darkness that would be everywhere, the weather, the cold. It's the perfect time for spooky things to start occurring. And therefore, Christmas or Yuletime is spooky time in Old Norse literature. Today, I'm going to tell you, like I said, about a short episode in one of the most famous outlaw sagas of the Old Norse corpus, and that is Grettis saga Ásmundarsonar. It is a saga from probably just before 1400 AD, so it's quite a late addition to the entire corpus. Like with most sagas, we don't know who wrote it down, but we do know that it must have been quite popular, and that the life of Grettir, in whichever way it took shape, whether it did in the way that we are told in the saga or not, left definitely some kind of impact upon Iceland and its society. There are still quite a number of place names which are associated with Grettir, and he had quite a big kind of popularity in the later centuries as well. A fun fact, at least for me, actually, is that when the Garfield comics came to Iceland, Garfield, so that orange cat who loves lasagna, he was renamed Grettir in the Icelandic editions because, just like the cat, Grettir is a big boy. He's ginger, and he's a bit unwilling to play by the rules. So I think that's a very fun way of keeping the medieval alive. But now I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the saga in general, so that you kind of know what is happening in the story, and then we're going to dive right into the haunting. So, as the title implies, Grettis saga is about Grettir Ásmundarsonar, and the saga can kind of be split into different sections. The first really tells us about Grettir's family, about his ancestors, how they left Norway and how they came to Iceland and how they established themselves there. This kind of first section also already builds up some of the issues that Grettir himself is going to face. So Grettir's father has a very difficult relationship with his own father, which we then also encounter in Grettir's own life. As Grettir grows up, it becomes kind of well known that he's not a very active boy. He's a bit bad-tempered, he's mischievous, he doesn't really want to do what he's told to do. But we also quite clearly see, and some scholarship has already pulled this out as well, that he's really not given a chance by his father. His father seems to have very high expectations of him, but is not really willing to give him any kind of real chance to prove himself without being immediately cut down for anything he might do wrong. However, Grettir's reaction to this shows that he himself is quite a complicated character because he is unable to control his emotions. He doesn't really think his actions through, and this kind of shows itself in how he engages with his father, but also, for example, with the animals that he's told to look after. There are some quite intense scenes of some animal cruelty when Grettir is kind of asked to look after the animals, which he feels is below him. But he does have a good relationship with his mother, Ásdís, who seems to be very supportive of him, and she does support him throughout his life as well. She's one of the most important relationships that he has. Eventually, he leaves Iceland and he goes to Norway for a bit. In Norway, he fights his first monster, a revenant, or what is known as an Abterganger in Old Norse. Sometimes they're also referred to as drauger, and you'll find that quite a lot in scholarship, but drauger is actually quite a rare word in the Old Norse prose. So that might be the wrong term for the category, and the saga themselves calls these revenants Abterganger, which literally means walking again. So they are people who come back from the dead, seemingly. So he fights the first of these in Norway, and he's triumphant there, and everyone's very impressed, and he kills bears and berserkers, but then he also gets into some trouble, and he has to go back to Iceland. In Iceland, we then encounter this Christmas haunting episode I'm going to tell you about, so I'll just skip over that for now. After his encounter with this second haunting, Grettir once again goes back to Norway. There he gets into more and more trouble because he accidentally kills some people by fire. And then there's a whole thing with the king who wants to kind of put him to justice, but people are kind of standing up for him and they're like, no, you shouldn't do this. He's a good man. It was an accident. And meanwhile, back in Iceland, Grettir is made into an outlaw for the deaths that happened during this fire. So when Grettir gets back to Iceland, he's told about this and he's like, great, now what am I going to do? And Grettir basically starts living on the land. He's just roaming around from one place to the other. And because he is an outlaw, they are allowed to kill him without punishment. So he's also being hunted by people and he's getting betrayed by others. And so he's just roaming around, sometimes going home to stay with his mother, but also just traveling around quite a bit. At a certain point, he's been running for quite a while, and he goes back to see his mother again, and she tells him to take his 15-year-old brother, Illugi, with him. And together they go and live on an island called Drangey, off the north of Iceland. One of the reasons he doesn't want to be alone will be revealed when I go into the haunting, but I think Grettir's also just tired of running, and he's been doing it for a long time now. So they go to this island where no one lives, but it's accessible with a ladder which they pull up. Grettir has been an outlaw at this point for over 19 years, which is the longest anyone has ever been an outlaw, and he's somehow still alive, just living on this island. Admittedly, being there, he's a little bit annoying to the locals, but he's doing his best, I think, with the tools that he's been given. And at this point, his family and friends also say it's insane that he's been an outlaw for this long. Surely he shouldn't be an outlaw for more than 20 years. That's what the law says the saga. We can't actually find a law like that in the law books. But they say, okay, it's enough. After his 20 years, let him become a normal man again. Now, so there's now a time window where Grettir is so close to kind of making it out of this outlawry. But unfortunately, there is also a man who is not entirely pleased with Grettir being on this island. So I'm going to keep this a little vague because it's very exciting and I think people should read this saga, but they make a final attempt on his life. And they get in there through the use of magic and other things that aren't entirely kosher. And finally, Grettir is defeated. And so is Illugi. And so his enemies are like, yay, we killed him before his time was up. We deserve to get the bounty that was on his head. And people are like, no, you used magic to kill this man. He was a good man even though he was an outlaw. And so the man who killed him has to leave. So the man leaves Iceland and he goes all the way to Constantinople, or Byzantium as it was known. And Grettir's half-brother, Thorstein, follows this man all the way there and actually avenges Grettir's death in Constantinople, which is incredibly important because it shows how much of an important man Grettir was, that someone would chase his killer all the way to the other side of the world. So the saga kind of ends on a note of Grettir was a great man, he just wasn't very lucky. And he was kind of a man out of time. He was still something of a hero of old, but the society around him was no longer a society that welcomed that, perhaps. So it's quite tragic, this saga, really. But we're going to dive into that haunting episode now, and we'll find out exactly why Grettir perhaps was a little unlucky. So, this most famous of haunting scenes takes place shortly after Grettir has come back from his first Norway trip. He's come back with a bit of fame and a bit of recognition for his strength and his power, and there's no one really to match him in Iceland. But the haunting actually starts somewhere else. See, there is a farmer called Thorhallr. He lives in Forsøydal, where he and his family have their own farm. So he lives there with Gudrun, his wife, and their son Grímr and their daughter Þuríður. They're doing pretty well for themselves, except their farm is haunted. So Thorhallr can't really find a herdsman for his sheep. Because of these hauntings, his herdsmen keep getting injured, and so they keep leaving before their contracts are up, and no one else wants to take the job. And Thorhallr quite simply needs someone to look after his sheep. So he goes to the Althing, and he asks Skapti Thoroddsonar for advice. Skapti guesses that there is some kind of evil spirit at work around his farm, and so he recommends a man called Glámr, who is a Swede, who has recently come to Iceland. Skapti says he's a strong and a big man, he's just not very friendly. Thorhallr says, no problem if he's not friendly, if he wants to work with my ghosts, that's good for me. So he goes back home. A short time after, Thorhallr is then on search for 2 horses, and they've gone missing. So he's kind of roaming around, and on his way he encounters a man who looks a little strange. He has got big blue eyes, but his hair is like as grey as a wolf. And Thorhallr is kind of surprised when he finds out that this man is Glámr, the man who got recommended to him by Skapti. But Thorhallr goes along with it. He's like, okay, I've been told you might want this job. And Glámr says, yeah, I'll do it. I ain't afraid of no ghosts. I think they're kind of amusing, actually. But Glámr warns him, I do want things done my own way. I'm not very good at getting told what to do. And Thorhallr is like, fine. So Glámr gets hired, and the summer passes, and everything is fine. Except, well, Glámr is not a Christian, which means he doesn't really get along with the traditions of the farm where he's at. He doesn't go to church, he doesn't keep fasts, and the people just find him generally unpleasant, really. The day before Yule, so the day before Christmas, Glámr demands some food from Gudrun, the farmer's wife. And she tells him it's a fast day. Glámr says, I do not care for these things. Give me some food. She's like, well, here's some food, but this is gonna be bad for you because we shouldn't be eating at this time. But Glámr does. The man is generally in a foul mood. But at this point, he goes outside to start looking after the sheep. The weather is absolutely horrible that day. There's strong wind, there's snow flurries, and a storm rolls in that evening. While Glámr is outside looking after the sheep, the rest of the farm goes to mass. When they return, they wonder where Glámr has gone, but they can't really find him, and it's storming outside, so they have to wait. The next day, they go looking for him, and they can see that there's been a big fight, and so they're kind of looking around, wondering what's going on, and then they find Glámr, and he is, and I quote from the saga, black as hell and swollen as fat as a bull. So this man's body looks horrendous. He's like black and blue, as big as you could imagine, kind of all swollen up. And they try and drag him to church for burial, but they can't move him all the way there. So they return to Thorhallr and tell him what has happened, and he's like, what killed this man? So he goes out himself, and Thorhallr finds this bloody trail, which leads him to think that kind of whatever evil spirit had been haunting the farm and the valley before has probably fought with Glámr, and they've both died in the process. So on the next day, they once again try to get Glámr into church for burial. Unsuccessfully, once again, this body will not go to church. So they return the next day with a priest, but now the body is nowhere to be found, which is spooky. The priest is like, this is not for me, and he gets out of there, at which point they somehow find the body again, and they kind of just place a mound of stones over him because this body clearly does not want to be buried in a Christian church. However, then the saga tells us that people become aware that Glámr is not resting quietly in his grave. Rather, he becomes a massive pain. Whoever sees him kind of walking around, being an Abderganger, a revenant, kind of loses their mind, and they become incredibly frightened. And then next, Glámr does something which is super weird, but very typical of Old Norse revenants, which is that he begins riding the house. He wrecks the roof, and people begin to abandon the farm. Now, what does riding the house mean? It can be hard to imagine, but I think you should literally just picture a man sitting on a roof as if it were a horse and a saddle, and just kicking his legs against the roof as if he's kind of riding the house, kind of literally what it says. So the roof is shaking, things are falling apart, and because he's so supernaturally strong, it is absolutely wrecking the place. It's very much like having a poltergeist in the house, except that Old Norse revenants aren't ghosts, they're physical, they're real, and that's why they're scary. So people have basically abandoned this farm. But next spring, Thorhalla tries to kind of hire new servants and keep things going. And, during the long days of summer where there's loads of light, the haunting does seem to calm down. Another stranger arrives in Iceland called Thorgauter, and he's looking for work, and he agrees to work for Thorhalla as a herdsman, even when he's informed of the hauntings. He says, that'll be fine. Come Christmas Eve, Thorgauter goes outside to the herd of sheep, and he does not return. On Christmas Day, a search party is organized, and they find Thorgauter, and his neck is broken, and so is every other bone in his body. Thorgauter is buried in church because he was a Christian. He didn't actually mind all of that, and so he never bothers anyone again. But Glámr, our actual revenant, just picks up his hauntings once again, and it's even worse than it was before. So everyone except the farmer, his wife, and their cowherd once again abandons the farm. However, shortly afterwards, the cowherd too is found dead, with his back broken. So Thorhalla admits that it's time, he packs up his family, and for the rest of the winter he stays with friends. Now, when something dramatic like this happens, people are bound to talk about it. Especially the people who abandoned the farm. I bet they rocked up at the next farm and were like, you will not believe what's happening over there. The house is being ridden by a revenant, everything's dying, the cattle is no longer happy, they're just dead, everything's horrible. So of course the story starts spreading. And Grettir Ásmundarsonar, recently returned from Norway, hears about this and thinks, this might be an excellent way to test my strength. Now, the friend he's staying with, Thorvaldur, does warn him. He's had this kind of feeling, and he says, Grettir, if you go there, it's just not going to end well for you, I think. But Grettir, being the slightly rambunctious man he is, he's like, nah, this is going to be great. So he rides to Thorhalla's farm, and he says, I will be spending the night here. Thorhalla warns him about the haunting, but he's also incredibly grateful to have this big, strong dude there, because he thinks maybe this will do something. And that first night, everything is calm and quiet. Everything's fine, the animals are fine, everyone can actually sleep, it's great. The second night, also everything quiet. Except now, the next morning they do find Grettir's horse, and it has been killed. So Glámr is definitely still there. Then the third night comes, and Grettir decides to go to bed fully dressed. He lies down on a sleeping bench in the hall, in front of the door where Thorhalla and his family are sleeping, and he puts a large cloak over himself, almost kind of hiding himself, and he keeps a close watch on the door. Now, during that night, Grettir does hear someone climbing up the house and riding the roof to pieces, and that goes on for quite a while. But then he hears someone come to the door. And it's opened, and a creature, absolutely horrendous to look at apparently, sticks its head in to have a peek. It's enormous, and it's kind of looking around and searching, and of course this is Glámr. Glámr thinks he can see a kind of lump on the bench, we are told, and so he goes over to kind of grab it. And he pulls at the cloak, but it doesn't move, so he keeps pulling, and then on the third pull he pulls so hard that it's ripped into pieces. And he wonders, what is holding this down? What is so strong that I, a revenant, cannot pull it apart? And that is the moment where Grettir jumps up from the bench and he grabs Glámr around the waist and he squeezes him. Now, Grettir is incredibly strong, especially at this point. He's never really had an issue kind of physically overcoming any other man, so he thinks this is going to do it. Absolutely. But this is Glámr we're talking about. So Glámr grabs him with an incredibly strong grip and just rips Grettir off him, and now the two are wrestling and they're struggling, and you have to really picture this as just two men going at it. They're breaking kind of posts and benches and chairs. Everything that wasn't yet broken in that hall is now broken. Glámr wants to get out of the hall into the open air, But Grettir kind of has this feeling where he thinks, once we get outside, I have a feeling that Glámr is going to be even stronger. So he's trying to stop that from happening, but they're kind of wrestling towards the entryway, with Glámr just pulling Grettir along with all his strength. Grettir realizes where this is heading, outside namely, and so he comes up with a plan. And he does 3 things at once, we're told. He throws himself against Glámr, he grabs him under the arms, and he braces his feet against something. And Glámr's not prepared for that, and so he is kind of launched backwards out of the door. A lovely detail we're then told about is that basically behind them the roof rafters break apart. This entire farm and hall is a wreck at this point. Anyway, outside, Glámr crashes onto the ground, and he's kind of just lying there for a second. And then the clouds move, and the moonlight comes through, and it shines straight into Glámr's eyes. For Grettir, it is a terrifying sight. Glámr's eyes somehow sap him of all of his strength, and Grettir just falls down, and he lies there between life and death, we're told. Glámr takes this pause in the fight to speak, or rather, to curse. He says, "You, Grettir, will never reach your full strength. The strength and power and respect you've acquired until now, that I will leave you with. But you will not gain any more. You will never reach your full potential. On top of that, from now on, I predict that you will become an outlaw. You will be judged for killings, and you will be followed by bad luck wherever you go. You will no longer be able to be alone, and my eyes will haunt you wherever you go, and this will be your death." Which is quite a lot. After these words, Grettir manages to pull himself back together, and with one stroke he hacks off Glámr's head and places it against his buttocks. Þórhallur now kind of carefully emerges from the hall, and he's just like, "Thank God, thank you, Grettir, it's over now." And Grettir's like, "Well, let's first burn this revenant here." And that's what they do, and then they bury the ashes as far away from humanity as possible. Then coming back, Grettir needs to lie down. He's feeling stiff and sore, and it's been quite a test. Þórhallur, meanwhile, tells everyone about what has happened, and so Grettir now becomes very well known for his strength and for his courage. Before he leaves, Þórhallur gives Grettir a good horse and fine clothes to replace what he's lost, and they part in friendship. Grettir now returns to his friend, Þórfardr, from before, who asks how things went, and Grettir admits that he has never experienced such a test of his strength before. Þórfardr asks him to just please show some restraint from now on, because again, he just knows there's going to be trouble in Grettir's future. Grettir is like, "Let's face it, I've never had real control over myself before, and that hasn't changed." But something has changed, because Grettir has become terrified of the dark, terrified of being alone, because his imagination is showing him all kinds of odd things in the dark, and he's seeing these eyes. And so the saga tells us that actually the term Glámr's sight or Glámr's eyes becomes something of a shorthand for those who see things other than they are. Grettir now returns home and stays there through the winter. And that is our haunting. It is a fascinating episode of Haunting, I think, because the saga really builds it up in a fascinating way. On the one hand, you get this different perspective where instead of following Grettir, we jump to this other farmer and we get a little bit of background information on him, on who he is, so we get a little bit invested, but we also know something is up right away. And the kind of different steps that the saga takes to build us up to the actual haunting is really interesting, because we get Þórhallur looking for advice, looking for a herdsman, and then we're like, great, here is this Swede, Glámr, and he's going to look after your sheep. Lovely. And then whatever was wrong before becomes so much worse once Glámr dies. And that's a really fascinating aspect of this haunting, because Þórhallur had some kind of spirit on his farm before. What that was, we don't know. The saga doesn't really tell us. Perhaps it was something troll-like. No one is entirely sure. But during that first Christmas, Glámr fights whatever is there, and they both die. The evil spirit that was there before is gone. Or is it? Because the question is also perhaps that evil thing that lurked there before is now kind of within Glámr. Because the way Glámr's body is found, so when it gets described as kind of swollen and massive, but also kind of black as hell, kind of this idea that that is perhaps a bit rotten or kind of blue and black, like in bruises, that kind of description gets used quite often for people who die mysterious supernatural deaths, or people who come back from the dead. They get described in that way. So something is clearly up with Glámr. And then they can't bury him properly, which is of course also an indication that something isn't right. And I love the idea of the priest coming out to maybe try and bless this body and then being like, nope, I'm not doing this. Thank you. I've got Christmas Eve sermon to prepare. Farewell. So quite quickly, we have loads of indications that things are about to get worse, and they do very quickly, because he rides the house, an image I love, and everyone who kind of sees him walking about just loses their mind. That's what the text says, that the sight of him is so horrifying that people become changed. They can no longer stay there, they no longer have control of themselves. And so it's really a big problem, a haunting like that. It's not that the cups get moved or that suddenly all your cupboard doors are open. No, there is actual damage taking place. Because revenants in Old Norse literature are physical. You know, they still have their body. They're a very strange mix between what we might think of a ghost, maybe a vampire. You know, it's those Abtergangers, those revenants in Old Norse literature are a really interesting creation of the society, I would say. So it becomes quite clear that an outsized problem like this needs an outsized person to take care of it. And that is exactly what Grettir is. He's got almost too much of everything, too much strength, too much character, perhaps with too much passion. The one thing he doesn't have too much of is control. So he is the one who decides, I'm going to handle this. And he does. I mean, he takes care of the problem, but the consequences of it for him are enormous. Because he is really affected by this fight, which you would imagine, you know, it's a big fight. You're going to walk away with maybe some scars and some potential trauma from something like that. But in this case, it really forms, for many readers at least, it forms a point of no return. It's that end of, you know, a second act in a Shakespeare play where you're like, okay, this play is a tragedy. Everything's going to get worse from now on. Everyone's going to die. Because Glámr's curse really halts Grettir in his development. It says you can no longer become stronger. From now on, everything's going to turn bad for you. And you'll be haunted by me, by the awareness of that. And that's exactly how it turns out. Grettir has a lot of bad luck in his life, and the one thing that leads to him becoming an outlaw is an accident, something he didn't mean to do. And yes, people died from that, but it wasn't something he intended. And this is what's going to cause his entire life to turn upside down. But what is really tragic for me is this idea that this man can no longer be alone or can no longer be in the dark. It is such a childlike, and I do mean childlike, not childish. It's such a childlike thing. It takes this really strong, kind of big personality, and it makes them vulnerable in a way they've never been before. And Grettir now is always searching for company, but because he's become an outlaw, he's not allowed to be in company. Company will kill him. That's the point of being an outlaw. You are no longer allowed to be a part of society. But this man is now cursed to always be searching for that connection. And that's extra tragic because of his childhood and the fact that he's never really received a whole lot of love, affection, and connection from his father. So you kind of see this really tragic pattern emerge, and this haunting episode really just elevates this and brings it to the forefront. Rebecca Merklbach has written about Grettir, but also the outlaws in general, in a very interesting way. So I will link to her book as well, because it does just provide a fascinating kind of insight into the psychology of a hero like that. And then, of course, the question is he a hero? You can ask so many questions about medieval literature. And I hope that that's something you take away from this episode as well. I should probably wrap it up. We're getting to half an hour here. So that is one of the most famous Christmas haunting episodes, or haunting episodes in general, from Old Norse literature. And although I hope your house remains unridden and unhaunted this Christmas time, I nonetheless hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'll be back next week with a kind of a roundup, but for now, I'd like to wish you happy holidays and a good start to the new year in case you don't hear me before then. That's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.